Welcome to our seminar on peace in Afghanistan, a declaration of war against Afghan women. My name is Cecilia Hall-Wiklund. I am the project manager for the work that the FBA does in Afghanistan. The FBA, the Folke Bernadotteakademin, is the Swedish Agency for Peace, Security and Development. And as part of Sweden's development cooperation with Afghanistan, we work to support the inclusion of women's perspectives and voices in peace efforts in Afghanistan. Over the past few years or so, there has been an inspiring hope for peace in Afghanistan, and particularly since the US has started talking with the Taliban about a deal that would allow for the Americans to withdraw militarily from the country. So far, the Afghan government hasn't been a part of these talks, but there's great hope that the next steps will be an intra-Afghan dialogue, which could possibly lead to a peace agreement between the government and the Taliban. Given, however, the Taliban's record on women's rights during their years in rule, there's obviously a great concern what the consequences of such a deal would be for women's rights. That's an issue that we're here to talk about today. I'm extremely glad to have our guests here. Mariam Safi, you are a researcher. You're the executive and the founder of DROPS, which is a research organization based in Kabul, with the particular aim of establishing a link between the policymakers and policy-oriented research, in focus of, amongst other things, are obviously women's perspectives on peace. And Heather Barr, you are a senior researcher on women's rights and the acting co-director of the Women's Rights Division of the Human Rights Watch, currently based in Islamabad, but having worked on and in Afghanistan for several years. So as I stated, the years of Taliban era was quite harsh for Afghan women. Mariam, I'd like to ask you, could you sort of describe the situation for women in Afghanistan during those years and give your perspectives?
Thank you, Cecilia. I want to thank FBA for having me here today. It's quite a privilege and honor to be here with you all. Under the Taliban regime, that period of time saw women discriminated against in many, many ways. The Taliban enforced their version of strict Islamic Sharia law, which saw women and girls being banned from going to school, from working, from leaving the house without a male chaperone, from accessing health care. And the only health care they could access at that time was, of course, health care delivered by men, which meant that since women were forbidden from engaging and moving out of their home, healthcare was virtually inaccessible. And from being involved in politics or public speaking. In a nutshell, if I were to put it to you, women were essentially invisible in public life and sort of imprisoned in their homes. Education enrollment prior to 2001 stood at about 1 million. And in that, girls' enrollment in school was under 1%. This has since increased ninefold. The number of schools have surged from about 3,500 to 16,000, a bit more than 16,000. Teacher investment has become quite a priority, and right now 39% of those enrolled in school are young women, are girls. However, even now, in the post-2001 period, the situation of women and girls in Taliban-controlled territory has not changed much. Girls' schools are still shut down, still forbidden to shop, travel, or visit a doctor alone. And public trials and execution of women are still taking place. In 2015, Radio Free Afghanistan reported the Taliban stoning of a 19-year-old woman for allegedly fleeing her home with her fiancé to find a place to get married. And this was in Ghor province. In 2017, reports by local media emerged of insurgents publicly holding trials and executing women over adultery and other charges. So there has been improvements, yet when we talk about the scenario now under territory under the control of the Taliban, not much has changed. Rather, in comparison to territory that is under control of the Afghan government and the Afghan state, we have seen progress.
So the situation is improved, but not where we would want it to be.
Of course.
And there was a survey released in the beginning of this year which stated that amongst the people surveyed, about 75% of Afghan men actually thought that women had too many rights today in 2019. And this was particularly the case amongst young Afghan men. Heather, do you have any perspectives on this, and what's sort of the challenges to advancing women's rights in Afghanistan?
Yeah, I mean, just to add to what Mariam said, I mean, I think we saw a real explosion of sort of women coming out of their homes and demanding their rights and going and claiming their rights after the fall of the Taliban in 2001. And just one example of that is the fact that Afghanistan has a specific quota for the number of women in the parliament, and it's about 28%, which gives Afghanistan a percentage of women that's about the same as the UK and higher than the US. So this is extraordinary and amazing, you know, and there are women in the army and women in the police and women judges and female ministers. So these are incredible examples of how progress on women's rights has really advanced very quickly in a short period of time compared to the centuries that other countries like Sweden have spent sort of working toward, but not yet reaching, gender equality. And I wanted to say, like, there are two factors that made that incredibly rapid progress possible. And one, of course, is the courage and hard work of women's rights activists in Afghanistan. And there are tons of women who, even during the Taliban time, were running underground schools, were doing whatever they could to sort of create employment opportunities and help other women survive. So that's one factor. But the other factor that's been absolutely essential as well is support from international donors. The funding that donors made available, the political pressure that donors put on the Afghan government created a space and resources that allowed these activists to really achieve some of these advances that we've talked about. And the part that is really heartbreaking about this is that we're already seeing signs of backsliding. In 2017, Human Rights Watch put out a report about girls' education in Afghanistan, and what we found was that at that point, according to the Afghan government's own statistics, there had been a decline in the number of girls going to school in 23 out of 34 provinces. There had also been a decline in the number of boys, but a much higher decline in the number of girls going to school. So serious backsliding already happening, and our finding was that we really identified three factors that were contributing to that. One, of course, was rising insecurity. The conflict has been escalating for many years now, and that's making it harder for girls to go to school. But that's not the whole story. Another part of the story is that there's less donor money available. And that means that some schools are closing down, particularly community-based schools that were funded specifically by donors and have run as a parallel system outside of the government's education system, but a parallel system that is specifically designed to serve girls. So they're the ones that are losing when these schools close down. So those are two of the factors. And the third factor is the government's lack of commitment to women's rights, frankly, the Afghan government. I think there are people in the Afghan government who are genuinely committed to women's rights, but there's never been an adequate sort of broad commitment, sincere commitment by the government, including on issues like girls' education. And that's why continued sort of international support and political pressure is really important if we're not going to see more and more backsliding.
But there are women in the government currently, and there's some women who are participating in sort of the adjacent peace talks. Mariam, could you comment a bit more about the role of women in political life and particularly as pertains to the peace process?
Of course, as Heather mentioned, there has been considerable progress both in the peace sector, the security sector, and in the development sector as a whole. In terms of, I don't think ever in the history of Afghanistan we've seen the participation and representation of women in the Afghan government as we do today. Afghan women as ministers, deputy ministers, women in the security sector. About 1.4% of the security sector, and that's both the Ministry of Interior and the Ministry of Defense, are now women, and that's quite it's an insignificant number if you look at the larger number of individuals that comprise of the Afghan National Security Forces. But if you compare this to the past, it's quite a leap forward. And in terms of peace and reconciliation, when the peace process first started officially in 2010, following the London conference, where the international community for the very first time pledged support for this process, women's groups and other stakeholders criticized at that time the lack of women's representation and voices in this process, and particularly women not being included or in every phase of this initiative. There were women's participation in the Peace Durga that was held in 2010, and that was a very positive step. However, these criticisms continued to progress. And last year, when we saw the momentum for the peace process build, once we had President Ghani made an offer of peace to the Taliban, then we had a ceasefire for the very first time since 2001 for 3 days. And then following that, the United States sat with the Taliban for the very first time. And that was a game changer. And it started to build a momentum behind the peace process. And when this process started, next to it, we had a women's movement in the peace process also emerge, comprised of various stakeholders. These are women's networks, women-run CSOs, women-run NGOs, women in the Afghan government, women in parliament, and sort of all women from these diverse sectors, despite differences of opinion and on issues, crossed ethnic lines, linguistic lines, religious lines, and came together. And the momentum that they also built simultaneously ensured that today, when we do have a negotiation process, where we have the development of an intra-Afghan dialogue, where we have dialogue that transitions from US Taliban to Taliban and the Afghan state, women will be on that table. So women will be represented on that table. We have a High Advisory Council on Peace and Reconciliation right now that has been created, and there are women's representation there. The High Council has 2 particular committees that are of importance. One is a negotiation committee that will be responsible for developing the negotiation team, and we have the representation of quite strong and prominent women there. And we also have a Red Lines committee, where we have women who are constitutional experts present in that committee. And so that's quite significant. However, one of the things that we have to be cognizant of is that by merely increasing the number of women participating in the negotiation team doesn't translate into women having an influence on the outcome of the process. Women have not been belligerents in these decades of conflict. They don't have what I would say constituencies of support. Therefore, whenever they present an opinion on the negotiation table, they're continuously forced to substantiate that opinion. So, for instance, if a woman says that on point A she gives her opinion, she has to show a document that says, well, 5,000 women support me and 10,000 women also say the same thing. But the men on that table don't have to do that. So what that means, we have to build constituencies of support for the women that are on that table in order for them to be heard. Now, in the development sector, peace without economic development is not possible. And peace without half of the Afghan population, which are women, is not possible. These 2 things, of course, need to come together. Development in particular, I mean, over the last decade, we've seen quite a rapid growth in economic development in the country due to advancements in the agriculture sector and the private sector, the extractive industry, and various other initiatives. However, in these areas, a positive step has been that 17% of the total national workforce are also women now. But the current momentum on the peace process creates opportunities for economic growth. If we have peace, then we can reduce expenditures in the military front, take those expenditures and pump that into various economic action plans that the Afghan government announced at the Geneva conference last year, which presents the Afghan government's economic growth vision. However, it's a necessity to have that because peace, as it brings opportunities, it will also have costs. One of the costs being reintegrating back into society and providing job opportunities for foot soldiers, for instance, in addition to having to reduce poverty levels and having to reduce unemployment levels. If we are unable to do these two things in particular, even if you have an amazing, a comprehensive peace agreement, you won't have the conditions necessary to move it forward. And in a country where unemployment is just about almost 50%, it's quite a daunting task. And within this sector, the private sector, and particularly women entrepreneurs and women businesses, can play quite a huge role. And therefore, we need to start incorporating the role of women in the private sector within the economic growth strategy to ensure that we involve half of our population not only in the peace process, not only in politics, but also in the economy and, of course, the security sector.
And pretty much as we speak, the Americans are actually holding negotiations with the Taliban in Doha in Qatar. The US has said that it's willing to withdraw its troops, but first it wants a commitment from the Taliban that it won't allow terrorists such as Al-Qaeda or other groups to operate from Afghan territory again. Heather, do you think there's a possibility for peace between the US and the Taliban, obviously, but also the Afghan government in the long haul?
So I wouldn't call the talks between the U.S. and the Taliban peace talks. I think that the U.S. intends to withdraw from Afghanistan, and they're negotiating the terms of that withdrawal. And what's really concerning to me is I think all Afghans want peace. They're desperate for peace, and women no less than men. But I'm very concerned about the U.S.'s strategy and the U.S.'s intentions in this process. There's been a real urgency by the U.S. to try and get this wrapped up and done, and the U.S.'s focus has really been on this promise from the Taliban that they won't let Afghanistan be used as a platform for international terrorism. So first of all, that's not a particular concern for Afghans. That's not the priority of Afghans. Second of all, how enforceable is that anyway? So it feels a bit like a face-saving. A bit of a fig leaf, for the U.S. to be able to send their troops home and say, yeah, but we got a really big concession from the Taliban in return. While what Afghans are worried about is, are they going to keep dying? Is their country going to have a future? And it's been very frustrating to watch the U.S. looking not particularly concerned about that. And there are huge risks for women's rights in this process. The Taliban is not that different right now from who they were in 2001. And some analysts and commentators, particularly from the U.S. side, have, I think, really exaggerated the ways in which they say that the Taliban have changed and reformed as a way of trying to be dismissive of this idea that there are risks for women's rights. So this new feminist Taliban, maybe thinks that girls should be allowed to go to school up until 5th grade if they're in a separate classroom from boys and have a female teacher and have a curriculum which has been approved by the Taliban as being Sharia compliant. So that's what the new reformed Taliban looks like, as opposed to, for example, saying no girls can go to school at all. The Afghan constitution, which the Taliban has said they want to rewrite, says that men and women are equal. Do you think the Taliban would like to keep that provision if they get a chance to take a red pen to the Constitution? And my concern is Zalmay Khalilzad, who's the chief negotiator for the U.S., He's improved his rhetoric a little bit in recent months on the importance of women's rights, the importance of women's inclusion. But several months ago, he gave a speech in a public forum, and somebody asked him, well, what about women's rights in this negotiation process? And he was completely dismissive. He said, well, I really think that's an issue for the Afghans, which is really, really frightening and really, I think, people talk about if you broke it, you own it, the U.S. came into Afghanistan, sold its intervention in a lot of ways by talking about women's rights. Laura Bush's speech about how the Taliban were cutting off women's fingers for wearing nail polish and whatever. We all know that that's not what the war was really about, but it was certainly sold to Americans that way. And so to see this kind of haste to run for the door and this dismissiveness about women's rights at this point is really disheartening and really highlights the importance of countries like Sweden trying to play a more positive role in terms of saying, yes, everyone wants peace, but something that's called peace that doesn't include women's rights is not peace.
Mariam, do you agree with this point that there's some difference, but not that much difference between the old Taliban and the Taliban we see today? And do you think there is any room for compromise on issues such as the constitution from a Taliban perspective, where there's a lot of talks about Afghan women's red lines, but what do you think the red lines of the Taliban might look like?
I would agree completely with Heather on the points that she articulated. First of all, the U.S. Taliban talks are not peace talks. We are in preliminary talks, and the peace process has not yet begun, has not yet started. In 2016, DROPS, the organization that I run in Kabul, published a policy brief on women, peace, and security. And in this document, we did interviews with a very small sample size, but with women from diverse backgrounds in 6 provinces in Afghanistan. And when we asked if a political agreement with the Taliban might bring about peace and stability in Afghanistan, a majority of our respondents believed that to be the case. However, while there has been this consensus, and this consensus has been reiterated by President Ghani many times as well, that there is a consensus on the peace process, all Afghans believe that a political solution is the right approach to end this conflict. Militarily, we've tried it for 17 years, and it's only escalated further and further. And civilian casualties have risen steadily, with slight dips here and there, but still quite a significant number. But when you ask different sectors of Afghan society, including, of course, women in Afghanistan, on how this peace should unfold, I do not believe that there is generally yet there's a consensus on broad strokes, but we still have a long ways to go to prepare Afghanistan to absorb an eventual peace agreement. See, the conflict has affected different parts of Afghanistan differently. So how could we possibly expect an agreement to be then absorbed and accepted by all segments of society from all regions of the country? For women in particular, fundamental questions continue to remain. I highlighted these questions last year on International Women's Day at the UN Security Council. And interestingly, a year and a half later, it's still quite relevant. The questions are, what are the red lines for negotiation? What would justice look like in an eventual settlement? How will the rights of women be upheld and protected? How will the participation of women in all levels be guaranteed in the implementation and monitoring of an agreement reached? What is the way forward after a peace agreement is reached? And what will peace mean to different sectors of Afghan society? We still have to find the answers, and the US Taliban talks provide no answers to any of these questions that we've pointed here, as you mentioned, Heather.
And just to add on that, I mean, what this process requires, what's needed to actually work through these questions that Mariam's highlighted is time and hard work and space. And the problem is that Trump is in the White House. And this is his process. And Zalmay Khalilzad, who's trying to negotiate on behalf of Donald Trump, is, I think, living with this axe hanging over his head, this fear that one morning Donald Trump is going to get up and tweet while he's having his breakfast that everyone's leaving, that Americans are all leaving Afghanistan the next month or two. So, I mean, there were rumors when the U.S. first started this intensified process that Khalilzad had been given a 6-month deadline. We don't know if that's true or not, but Michael Pompeo has now said that the U.S. wants an agreement by September. That's wildly unrealistic in terms of actually having a peace agreement. If all you want is a withdrawal agreement, then sure, you could do it. You could do it this afternoon if you want, but that's not peace.
Yes, and we have elections coming up in Afghanistan towards the end of September. So a potential pact between the U.S. and the Taliban before then, we're trying to wrap our heads around how this will impact the peace process. I think very few have any idea whether this impact will be positive or negative. And pursuing a peace process in the pace at which it has been in the last few months, and that too within an election year, has been one of those factors that has made this process ever so challenging. But with this recent momentum in the last few months, initially when it started, different sectors of Afghan society, including women's organizations and activists, felt that this was a positive step. There are certain priorities that fall within the prerogative of the United States to speak to the Taliban. But then the agenda of talks, as Heather mentioned, a two-point agenda, the lack of Afghan voices in this discussion have given rise to new sets of concerns for women. And these concerns go beyond just highlighting the importance of women's direct participation in the peace process. It concerns their demands on how this process should be led to ensure inclusivity, and how it should unfold to ensure ultimately sustainability. The talks are based on a narrow agenda. Afghan women in particular are concerned, as Heather pointed, of whether the gains of the last 18 years would be protected or guaranteed in an eventual settlement. Until date, we haven't yet seen any assurances that could point to that. Khalizad eventually added another 2 points to the agenda after, and I would credit this to the women's movement in the peace process, calling for a cessation of hostilities, so a ceasefire, and then also an intra-Afghan dialogue in which the Taliban will have to sit with the Afghan state and all stakeholders. So he added these two, and then he said, nothing is agreed upon until everything is agreed upon. But I, for one, I'm very tired of hearing these nice narratives and rhetorics, and that's all it is, because we have not yet seen anything substantial come out of these talks, and now we have to wait until the 7th round ends to see if it will produce something. And if it produces an intra-Afghan dialogue, that's a positive step. But we have elections coming up. And so once again, timing here may not be on the sides of Afghans.
Could you explain a bit more about the challenges of elections and having that simultaneous with the peace process? But I think maybe our audience aren't quite sort of in tune with the political life in Afghanistan.
Of course, with the Taliban have repeatedly stated that they would not sit with the Afghan government. They said that the Afghan government is not one that is representative of the population. And they point out to the discrepancies of the 2014 election that gave rise to the National Unity Government as one of those reasons. Now, if we have elections taking place and you have a pact and then an intra-dialogue is supposed to take place before elections, if the state is a part of that, but the head of the state then goes into elections, and whether he is elected or not, some would say, why would we need elections? Why don't we have an intra-Afghan dialogue? Bring everybody on the table, have them negotiate with the Taliban, and then hold elections. We have resources, money, there's going to be a heightened insecurity around the country at that time. And then others would argue, absolutely not. Elections is the pillar of our young democracy. And when you hold elections, you're sending a message across to the Taliban saying that this is a pillar or this is a principle that you cannot change, that you will have to function within this apparatus in any agreement. So holding elections is imperative. But if we have intra-Afghan dialogues before then, it's a bit ambiguous for us as to how that would work out. But that's because there is no clarity in this process. There is no transparency in this process. So we don't have the answers. And so it's a waiting game, I have to say.
With great contradictions in the timelines of the elections and the American sort of haste. There's been lots of arguments saying that from Afghans that I've spoken to and from the government saying, well, we have to be careful about threading the issue of human rights too hard with the Taliban, because then they might not be too interested in continuing these moving the inter-Afghan dialogues forwards. And some arguments to say that, well, maybe the negotiating office of the Taliban, which is hosted in Qatar, that they might be more moderate, but then that the file and rank soldiers of the Taliban would not be willing to accept any sort of compromises on women's rights that the Qatar office might be willing to. Do you think that this is a correct assessment? That it might be difficult for the Qatar negotiation office of the Taliban to actually have a peace agreement be implemented if it's too lenient on women's rights from a Taliban soldier's perspective? Or is that just an argument to keep women's issues out of the process?
Well, the Taliban has been, of all the parties involved, the Taliban have been, in my opinion, the most consistent in their messaging, the most consistent with their overall objective, though they don't offer details for their demands as well. Over the few years that particularly since 2010, that I've been observing. The Taliban like to portray themselves as one homogenous group. And I would say that if the ceasefire, the Eid ceasefire of last year was any indication of that, then yes, they are. And sort of say, when a ceasefire was announced by the leadership of the Taliban, it meant a ceasefire. And we had 3 days where Taliban had left their territories, entered government-controlled territories. Flowers were exchanged, hugs were given to one another. I mean, it was quite a sight. And it for the very first time, and since 2001, it gave Afghans that have faced nothing but death and destruction and poverty for 40 years now, a taste of hope. And it was palpable. You could feel it almost. And so that moment showed to us that perhaps there's a rank and file, and that rank and file will accept what is ordered from the leadership. However, there are others that would say that the Taliban are not a homogenous group and that there are very deep divisions within this group. And these divisions have come more to the surface now when the peace process started to gain more and more momentum, and the U.S. has now sat down with the Taliban. I feel that I cannot say if the Doha office, there is not a lot of evidence for me to make any other assertion, but I can just say that I don't believe that the rank and file would necessarily go against any direction given on a peace process if an agreement is put forward. I think that there are a lot of differences in opinion on this process. Even right now, if you look at the subnational level where the Taliban control territory, whether they allow a school to be open in one area to a school not open in another area, all depends on their conditions. It also depends on the socio-political and socio-economic conditions of where they are. You know, the pie is only so much at the subnational level. So sometimes they negotiate and renegotiate positions and what they are not receiving out of it. So if you look across the country, not girls' schools, for example, are not closed across the country. In some places they've negotiated, they've kept it open. In some places they've closed it. So that shows that there isn't one action taken particularly, let's say, just with the example of education. But I think that they would overall accept an agreement, but I think that there would be differences of opinion on it, but nothing that would mean that large chunks of the Taliban will leave the insurgency. I think there will be breakouts. There will be some breakouts, yes, but nothing that might jeopardize the Taliban's position on the table, because I haven't seen anything like that as of yet. But I have to say that the rank and file is, in my opinion, very ideologically inclined. There are these concepts of a $10 fighter, $10 a day fighter and whatnot. So you've had instances, reports where, you can, for economic reasons, you have young men joining the ranks of the Taliban. But I would say then there's also issues of honor and legacy that play into here. And individuals, particularly practitioners in the field of countering violent extremism, have identified an array of issues that entice young men to join the regime. And I think that ideology is a key factor here. So what this means to me is that when there is an agreement, I think that the Taliban leadership can play around with the political system and maybe be compromising or a bit flexible. They can also be flexible in maintaining or preserving state institutions and all of those. But I think the one place, and this is what is so concerning, is that when it comes to the Constitution, within the Constitution, the rights and privileges and afforded to women and the way the women have progressed, I think that is going to be a sticky point between the rank and file and the leadership, which shows to me that the leadership, if flexible in other areas, would not show much flexibility in this area because they would lose face with their rank and file.
Heather, do you think it's possible to combine a Sharia law constitution, which is what the Taliban wants, and human rights? And also, what kind of state do you think that the Taliban is after? This usually talks about the model that the Taliban might be looking to. Is Iran? Do you think that's the case?
I mean, it's interesting because the Afghan constitution already combines Sharia and human rights. It specifically talks about how Hanafi jurisprudence will be applied, and it says that nothing in the constitution can be against Islam, while also saying that men and women are equal, which, assumes that in the eyes of the drafters of the Constitution, equality of men and women was also compliant with Islam, which is what many scholars think who study Sharia law, but obviously not what the Taliban thinks. So to some extent, what's on that piece of paper matters less than who's in control of the country and who's running things. The Taliban's vision for what they think Afghanistan should be like, as I said, I don't think it's that different now than it was in 2001. I think what's different is that the Taliban, I think, have realized that Afghan society has changed and that they need some level of popularity and acceptance among the population in Afghanistan. They can't just impose their will, particularly if they're regaining power through a negotiation process. And Afghan society has changed dramatically since 2001. And even in 2001, I think the Taliban were out of step with how, the broad consensus in Afghanistan. Afghans want their daughters to go to school. Afghans want women to be able to leave the house and go to work. Women want that, men want that. Of course, there are some people who hold different views, but I think they're a small and shrinking minority. I hope that what the Taliban really want in their heart of hearts is not that relevant at this point. But I just really fear that there's been a lot of discussion for the last 10 years, for the last 15 years about, what could bring an end to the conflict in Afghanistan. There's been a lot of discussion about what a negotiated settlement might mean for women's rights. There's the UN Security Council Resolution 1325, which says that women have a right to be full participants in any peace process. There are a lot of donor countries, particularly some of the Nordic countries, including Sweden, that have really tried to, in different ways, support some of the groups that are doing the activism that Mariam's talked about sort of, women have been fighting for a place at this table for at least 10 years, and nothing's been given to them. They've had to fight the whole way. They've had resistance from the Afghan government. They've had sort of wavering support from the international community, more financial support than political support. But this is the moment right now. This is the moment when that matters. So all that work that Sweden or any other country was doing to fund various programs to try and increase women's political participation in Afghanistan since 2001, this is the moment that the rubber hits the road and that it really, really matters, and where we really see whether there's been any accomplishment or not that's meaningful and permanent. And I guess my worry is that, we have a U.S. government, which has shifted from, I think, being, a sort of generous but somewhat disengaged supporter of women's rights in Afghanistan to being pretty openly hostile to women's rights around the world. And then we have other countries who have been consistent supporters of women's rights, but who are increasingly disengaged, who've kind of left the building. They've left the building mentally, to a lesser extent, but still significant extent. They've left the building financially, and that's part of what makes this moment so dangerous. Is that we've suddenly got this massive rush to get a deal done, get it done right now, and the people who have been the supporters of women's rights in Afghanistan are sort of checked out and not paying that much attention. And that's what really, really worries me. I mean, on my recent trips to Kabul, my recent discussions with donors, like I'm just struck again and again by this sort of disengagement and almost boredom that you feel in some of these discussions. 5 years ago, if you were talking to diplomats in Kabul, they were probably young and inexperienced and 3 months into their 1-year tour, and then they were going to go off again. They were 26 years old, and but they were trying desperately to figure it out. They were super engaged. They were super interested. They were sort of sucking up every word you had to say and trying to find the solution to Afghanistan. And that's all gone now. Like, it's just sort of, it feels like an assignment that nobody really wants. And people got stuck being sent there, and they're sort of counting the days until they can leave and go somewhere where they can go for a walk and not be locked in their compound all the time. And that's very, very dangerous for Afghan women.
I think in 2001, with the toppling of the Taliban regime and the international intervention spearheaded by the US, followed by the European Union, NATO, of course, there was hope. This sense of hope had emerged. And whenever you speak to anybody in Afghanistan who was in Afghanistan during that period, they articulate this. But that hope has faded. That hope has faded, and we're at a time where we need to now basically put our efforts together and try to, not only at the international level, but also at the regional level. Afghanistan is in the midst finds itself in a region that is grappling with a lot of socioeconomic and sociopolitical challenges and issues, and the continuous conflict between various proxies that end up playing out in Afghanistan is one that has prevented the country from being able to set the foundation or the conditions for any degree of stability. And so with the international community having arrived in Afghanistan, hope emerged that perhaps we can now find ways and mechanisms through the UN Security Council and through other platforms and forums, like the Kabul Process Forum, for example, at the Heart of Asia Istanbul Process, another example, to be able to address the concerns regional countries have and be able to set the country and Afghanistan and the region as a whole on the path forward. Because Afghanistan is referred to as the heart of Asia. And Afghanistan's economic vision is reliant upon its ability to integrate the region economically. And so all of those interrelated factors play out. But I wanted to also touch upon the issue of the constitution and the Taliban. The Moscow event in February, where political parties and presidential candidates and a few other stakeholders attended that process. The Afghan government was not there. And in that, out of the Moscow process, the Taliban came out with a statement. And in that statement, they were just a word shy of calling for a new constitution. I would interpret it still as them calling for a new constitution. They used to say revisions. Back in 2016, they used to talk about revisions. And I say 2016 because I have had direct conversations with the Qatar office at that time. But now it's not even revisions. It's pretty much a new constitution. And that's been one of the outcomes of the United States sitting with the Taliban. It has really strengthened their position. And I would say that they said in their statement, and I wanted to read this out, that they said that the group will not stop Afghan women from going to school, universities, and work. However, in their statement, they said that a woman may also serve in a political office, but cannot become president. So that was actually in the statement. So no presidency for any Afghan women who aspire to become president in the country. And And when I was speaking to women who were at the Moscow conference, they said that the Taliban also highlighted that in terms of women cannot be judges either. So there are, the devil lies in the details. And I guess perhaps that's one of the reasons why the Taliban don't offer any clarity when we ask them what they want to change in the constitution.
Yeah, I mean, just to say, there was an interview a couple months ago with the Taliban spokesperson, Zabiullah Mujahid, and where he talked about how, yes, of course, women would be free to participate in work in fields like education and healthcare, which suggests that, like, you can teach school and you can be a midwife and that's it. So, yeah, I mean, it's interesting. I mean, the Taliban has always said, oh, we will grant women all of the rights that they have under Islam, which is a wonderfully vague phrase, you know, which means we'll grant them whatever rights we've decided our version of Islam permits them to have, which is clearly something far, far short of equality.
Yes, and the Constitution as a whole, as Heather mentioned, Islamic principles have been written into the very fabric of this document. Ghazal Haris, who's a constitutional expert in Afghanistan, wrote a fantastic article on this topic, and she highlights the first two articles of the Constitution define Afghanistan, A, as an Islamic republic, and recognizes Islam as its religion. Article 3 prescribes laws that contravene the tenets and the rulings of Islam in Afghanistan. And on the judicial front, the Constitution requires members of the Supreme Court to ensure justice in accordance with the tenets of Islam and the proceedings and the cases that they see. In 2004, the Taliban also say that the Constitution, because it was done with the participation of the international community, the conditions that were set by the international community, it's a Western document. However, the Constitution actually is heavily based upon the Constitution of 1964. And in fact, Ghazal Haris writes in her paper that it was so heavily based on the 1964 Constitution that it created disputes within the drafting and the review commissions, with some arguing that Afghanistan should adopt more modern constitutional provisions rather than going back to a constitution adopted 40 years ago. So the points that the Taliban are making against the constitution are not on solid ground. And the fact that they want some sort of they want an agreement which could mean that they would come to Afghanistan and start a peace process, already having accepted that the constitution will change. And well, that's not fair. And I don't think that anyone with a sound mind in Afghanistan, and I hope not the US either, agrees to such a condition, because it will open a can of worms, and these are the worms that I'm talking about.
Yeah. Thank you so much. We've run out of time, but I think that what I take from here is that a danger for women's rights in Afghanistan is just not coming from the Taliban, but the inconsistencies in timelines and priorities and so on from the different actors involved, and also its need for stronger engagement from the international community to push for the preservation of at least women's rights as they are today, but also the advancements of them in the future. Thank you so much for coming, to both of you. Thank you.